A lot of people have been talking about the end of the US dollar recently, albeit not always in a literal sense, but sometimes just in terms of its position as the world's reserve currency. Even Ray Dalio, the legendary and probably most successful hedge fund investor in the world, has been talking of this recently, so it's easy to see why it's been getting so much attention over recent months. But in recent weeks, the possibility of this happening has evolved into a whole other level. The war in Ukraine has led to unprecedented sanctions levied against Russia. The country is now the most sanctioned country in history, and it's not even close. But Russia is a country rich in natural resources, and they're still being extracted, and Russia is still trying to sell them. The country and the world's reliance on the US dollar and the financial infrastructure that surrounds the dollar is causing Russia a world of pain and opening up the eyes of other states to the true power that the US holds over them. For a few weeks then, we've been hearing opinion pieces and news articles about the potential for countries who maybe don't align too closely with the US and their plans to go their own way, build their own systems and basically escape the US dollar. Well, the reason we're talking about this today is because that is no longer hearsay. It's no longer a distant possibility. This process may have just started right in front of our eyes with Saudi Arabia and a new deal regarding oil that is terrifying for the United States. Today we're going to talk briefly about how this supposed new deal and how the US dollar just might be on its way out. So what exactly is going on? Well, Saudi Arabia is in talks with China about settling oil transactions in the Chinese yuan instead of the US dollar. This stems basically from the war in Ukraine and the realization of the risk that the US can pose to other countries because of how reliant they are on the US dollar. Now, you might just expect Russia to be the only country looking for alternatives here, but that hasn't turned out to be the case. Both Saudi Arabia and China are also looking to reduce their dependence on the US as well, and for China, that isn't too surprising, but for Saudi Arabia, actually it is. Now, Russia invading Ukraine is eerily similar to China's situation with Taiwan, and while that hasn't evolved into a full-on war yet, there is a decent chance that it might go that direction in the future. Chinese rhetoric has been right on the same tracks as Russian rhetoric. Taiwan doesn't have the right to be a country. The Taiwanese and Chinese people are one and the same, and China is the rightful ruler of the island state. Whether or not any of this is true is irrelevant. China doesn't control the island. It has its own democratically elected government, and the only way that China is going to achieve its goals is probably by starting a war, sending over thousands of troops, and killing thousands of people. Now, we've just seen in real time that the West is not willing to stand by as an innocent democratic country is invaded by an authoritarian state. By all measures, the chances of the West just allowing Taiwan to be invaded are very slim, and economic sanctions are pretty much guaranteed if China goes in that direction. Now, China still wants control over Taiwan, and they've even set themselves a deadline, a time limit by which the island must be in their control. So it makes perfect sense that China would start to prepare itself for the sanctions that will be inevitably coming. A big part of that is going to be ending the use of the US dollar when dealing with other sovereign states, particularly when large quantities of oil or other natural resources are being traded, and that's exactly what we're seeing here. Now, Saudi Arabia's relationship with the US is far more complicated, and that's why this has been a bit of a surprise to many people. For the most part, over recent years, the Kingdom of Saud and the West have been on the same side. We supply their army with vehicles and weapons. We sell them planes and bombs that they use to kill civilians in Yemen. Some might say that's very on brand for the West. But tensions between the countries, Saudi Arabia and the US in particular, are starting to strain. One major point of conflict recently was the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, a journalist from Saudi Arabia but based in the US, who was murdered by order of the King of Saudi Arabia when he walked into his embassy. This was a pretty horrific act of violence carried out by an authoritarian state, and it served as a jolt to the US and the West as a whole as to the reality of that government and that country and just how brutal and inhumane they are. The fact that just a few days ago Saudi Arabia executed 81 people in one day should say enough as well. Just being gay in that country can warrant corporal or capital punishment. To say this goes against the values of Western democracies is not exactly a leap, and the worst thing about this all is that Saudi Arabia doesn't really want to change. They want to keep women out of work. They fought for years against even allowing them to drive cars, and being closely allied to the US, being dependent on the US dollar and having your power emanate from Western weapons is not good news for a despot determined to keep his country in the dark ages. So we see quite clearly the motivation behind these kinds of moves. It's just the simple idea that these countries and their rulers don't want to be dependent on the US dollar or the financial system carried by the US like SWIFT. Now in the past, the idea was basically that yes, the US had this power, but we'd never actually see it exercised. But as Russia's economy collapses further into despair every single day, we see just how wrong that idea was. The US and their allies did use that power, they did use that influence, and if they used it against Russia and completely destroyed their economy within a matter of weeks, they could do the same to Saudi Arabia, to China, to India, to Iran, or any other country really. So we are seeing a major push right now to move away from the dollar towards independent systems. The reality is that right now, oil all over the world is traded with US dollars, as are most other industries on this scale. This gives the US dollar a certain amount of intrinsic value. You need dollars to buy oil, and you need oil, so you need dollars. It follows very logically. If, though, the developing countries of the world, maybe the countries who aren't democracies, start to make consistent and steady progress towards the normalization of using other currencies as basis for transactions, the US risks losing the dollar as the world reserve currency, and that would wreak havoc on the American economy. One of the reasons the US can run up such a large deficit, run up crazy amounts of debt and print money at ridiculous rates without seeing a devaluation compared to other currencies is because the demand for the dollar is so great around the world. If that were to change, frankly, the dollar will lose its value rapidly. If you want an example of what that could look like, then the Turkish lira just might be a good place to start as an example of how a currency's value changes as inflation runs too high. Now, as of right now, this process is not too far gone. It's not all decided, and the situation is not on a path set in stone. This news of the talks between Saudi Arabia and China is just talks at this point, and even then, they're talks of denominating some of their oil transactions in a different currency, not all. And even then, the oil that is sold might be exchanged for one, but the amounts of one will still be measured in US dollars. Basically, what we have here is a step. A small step, but a step nonetheless, closer to the end of the dollar's status as the reserve currency of the world. The reality is, we are probably multiple decades away from seeing the US dollar actually lose that status, but there is a good chance we are finally on that path, and for many US lawmakers, the people who push for those huge spending packages and crazy deficits and money printing as well, that's a worrying prospect because it would mean the US would have to fundamentally change. Is the US dollar going to continue to be weaponized? Probably. Are other countries like China and Russia going to continue to de-dollarize? Again, probably. The really interesting thing that we don't have an answer for right now is whether or not cryptocurrency will play a role in this new world order. My gut instinct says it will, but there are many who fundamentally disagree with me there as well, so we just have to wait and see. Now, just one final thing before we sign off for today. Make sure to check out the two other Stoic channels, the politics and the crypto one down below. Both are going to be kicking off full speed in no time at all, so make sure to subscribe to them to make sure you don't miss out when those videos start going live. If you enjoyed this video, then make sure to like, comment and subscribe to bless the YouTube algorithm. If you want more content like this, then check out our Patreon and join our community of investors. You get access to our Discord, loads of exclusive content like insight into my portfolio and buy and sell alerts for all my own investments. There's a link in the description to masterworks.io, a site that allows you to buy fractional shares of art from world famous artists like Banksy and Basquiat, which can be a great way to diversify your portfolio with non-market correlated assets that aren't manipulated by the Fed. It's completely free to sign up, so if that sounds interesting, then make sure to check it out. There's also a link in the description to BlockFi, which will give you up to $250 in free Bitcoin when you use it. You can also get 9% interest on stablecoins like USDC, which is a far higher rate than you get from any savings account these days. Just make sure not to use Tether. Thank you all for the support, thanks for watching, stay stoic, until next time.